Starr Forum. We're thrilled to have with us today Christian Caryl, who is here for a book talk on his book, Strange Rebels, 1979 and the Birth of the 21st Century. Before I tell you a little bit more about Mr. Caryl, I wanted to call to your attention a couple of events that are coming up in the near future. Friday, October 4th, we will have a photojournalist with us who had been in Syria and had also, as of April of this year, was in captivity of Syrian rebels for 81 days. But he will be showing his photos and talking about Syria, the mainstream media, and its role in the war. And his name is Jonathan Alperi. And also, after that, on October 9th, we are having another book talk with Chase Madar. And joining Chase Madar, who is the author of The Passion of Bradley Manning, the story behind the WikiLeaks whistleblower, is also Noam Chomsky, who will be giving an introduction on that book talk. And I also wanted to remind you, today we'll hear from Christian and then we'll do a Q&A, but please go up to the mic so we can hear what you're saying in the video. And also, we are selling books, and Mr. Caryl is signing books as well. Now, Christian Caryl is a senior fellow at the Legatum Institute and a contributing editor at Foreign Policy magazine, where he edits Democracy Lab, which is a special online publication devoted to countries aspiring to make the transition from authoritarianism to democracy. He is also a senior fellow at the Center for International Studies here at MIT and a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. From 2004 to March 2009, he headed the Tokyo Bureau of Newsweek. And before that, from 2000 to 2004, Mr. Caryl served as Newsweek's Moscow bureau chief. After 9/11, he carried out numerous assignments in Iraq and Afghanistan as part of Newsweek's reporting on the War of Terror. Earlier, Mr. Caryl served as Moscow bureau chief for U.S. News and World Report starting in July 1997. And before moving to Moscow, Mr. Caryl spent 13 years as a freelance journalist in Germany, where he contributed to multiple publications. In his journalistic career, he's reported from 37 countries. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Christian Caryl.
Thank you very much. So can you hear me all right? Does that sound like a good level? Okay. So thank you so much for coming today. It's really great to see all of you, and I look forward to telling you about the book. First of all, I'm going to try to show you something here, if I can get this extremely high-tech system to work. So this is a brief film, a trailer we prepared about my book, and unfortunately I can't put it on the whole screen or it will crash. So we're going to try it this way.
It wasn't actually that long ago. A lot of us who are around now lived through these events. We didn't necessarily understand what we were seeing on our TV sets. We didn't understand how the things that happened would continue to define the world we live in today. If you want to understand the 21st century, you have to understand what happened at the end of the 1970s. Our world is defined by the failure of communism, by the rise of market economics, and by the power of politicized religion. 1979 was the moment when all of these ingredients came together. 1979 was the year that the Iranian Revolution toppled the Shah and brought forth a new Islamic republic led by Ayatollah Khomeini. The Soviet Union launched its invasion of Afghanistan in order to shore up the government there against a revolt by Islamic holy warriors. John Paul II visited Poland for the first time as Pope. His visit triggered a campaign of nonviolent resistance that ultimately helped to bring down communism in Eastern Europe. Margaret Thatcher was elected British Prime Minister, ushering in a new era of conservative politics and free market economics. 1979 was also the year that Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping launched the economic reforms that brought his people out of the Maoist dark ages and returned his country to superpower status.
The building behind me is the old Iranian embassy here in Washington, D.C. It's been deserted ever since Washington and Tehran broke off diplomatic ties after the Iranian Revolution and the Iran hostage crisis. Remember Argo? That was 30 years ago. Today, the building still stands, waiting.
Today, Iran remains under the control of the people who led its revolution. But that's far from the only legacy of 1979 that continues to shape our world. Today's capitalist China is light years away from the society that confronted Deng when he became leader. The Muslim world is still contending with the effects of the war.
Oh, okay. Well, I think you got the basic idea. It crashed anyway, so such is life. So thank you again for coming. I'm going to elaborate on the ideas which were touched upon very briefly in this video, so no great loss. You can certainly watch it online. I'm sure it won't crash then. So how did I get the idea for this book about the end of the 70s? Well, it's pretty simple. A few weeks after 9/11, I ended up in Afghanistan. And a few weeks after that, I ended up in Kabul, which had just been liberated from the Taliban. And it was a very, very interesting moment to be in Kabul, precisely because this was the moment when it seemed as if things that had long been repressed were coming back to life in a way. I went to the bookstore down the street from the place where we were living, and they had recently unearthed a lot of the books and the postcards of Kabul the way it used to be. They'd hidden them all from the Taliban because, as you know, the Taliban didn't have much fondness for human images. And among those images, I saw pictures of unveiled women posing in fashion photos, beautiful brand new international hotels that had just been built in Kabul, kids going to school, factories, brand new glistening factories had just been built. All that happened in the 70s, okay? And at this time, it was January 2002 to be precise, if you walked around Kabul, you would see a lot of 1970s American cars, big gas-guzzling cars, or VW Bugs, which I guess weren't strictly American, but they definitely had that 70s feel to them. Some of these cars had 8-track tape players in them, if any of you remember that magnificent technology. A lot of the buildings in Kabul were actually built during the 1970s, especially public buildings, ministries. And while I was there, the US Marines were sent in to reopen the old American embassy, which had lain dormant basically ever since the Soviets invaded. And in the basement, they found big piles of vinyl records, Billy Joel, and a turntable to play them on. And they also found 20-year-old beer, which, of course, being Marines, they promptly drunk. So there was this strange time warp quality to being in Kabul and Afghanistan at this time. Even the house that I and my fellow journalists in was like something out of my childhood. It had shag carpeting, tubular aluminum light fixtures. It was this big ranch-style house. And that was the kind of house they were building in Kabul in the 1970s, if people were wealthy, because that was the style. There was a lot of building going on. And I found myself wondering, what the hell happened, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I understand that Afghanistan was not a perfect society in the 1970s, right? It had many profound, far-reaching political problems. There were deep tensions, inequality, all this stuff. But the fact of the matter is there was a lot of development going on. It was a huge tourist destination, if you can imagine that now. I talk about this in my book. So what happened? How did that whole thing grind to a halt? Well, of course, the answer is perhaps not simple, but it's fairly straightforward. 1978, a communist government came to power in a coup, immediately ran into trouble from Afghans who were not very happy with its program for restructuring society, and then the Soviets invaded to shore up that government. So I thought very strongly about writing a book about this moment, but I couldn't quite get a handle on it. It didn't seem like quite enough for a book in its own. And by the way, while I'm thinking of it, let's see here. This is, as long as we're talking about Afghanistan, this is a wonderful slideshow, which I strongly recommend you look at on Foreign Policy's website, the magazine for which I work. And we periodically do these great slideshows called Once Upon a Time, which is a way of reminding people that places change. This is one of my favorite photos of 1970s Afghanistan. And then we can quickly scroll through here. You see female, I believe, medical students, completely uncovered. Although in a lot of these photos, here are more women studying at university. The nurses at least have head coverings on, right? Nurses. This is one of my favorites. I don't know if anybody knows Afghanistan personally from the 1970s. I'm not sure if these are the uniforms that they were wearing in school then, but I think these are Afghan Girl Scouts. I'm not entirely sure, but I have a feeling that's what they are. You will see, compared to the pictures of Iran from this period, that a lot of the women are in fact wearing some kind of head covering, like the two women here, or in the playground. Here's a factory, one of those brand new factories I was talking about. More factories. Or, for example, this is a very interesting scene, again in Kabul. Women wearing scarves. Nobody's wearing a burqa. It's just, what's that, a burqa? So I was fascinated by this idea that there was some kind of radical transformation at the end of the 70s, but I wasn't quite sure how to describe it, how to turn it into a story. And you can easily imagine the next place I found myself in one of my postings for Newsweek was Iraq. And again, rather similar, not quite as dramatic as in Afghanistan, but a lot of people driving 1970s American cars. Again, we found ourselves living in a 1970s throwback house. And what happened in Iraq at the end of the 1970s? Well, Saddam Hussein, who had been the power behind the throne for many years, finally made himself president in 1979. And then a year later, Iraq went to war with Iran, 8 years of war, end of that brief period, and then the first Gulf War, and then on and on and on and on. Conflict, sanctions, another war. So again, what was it about this moment that represented such a fundamental break, right? Why did these countries hit a wall at this kind of similar moment in history? And then I ended up for Newsweek again in Tokyo as a correspondent. And that, of course, confronts you with East Asia. And East Asia has its own very distinct, very different experience in the 1970s, which is very much, again, an experience of modernization, but it is an experience of modernization that kind of, if anything, accelerates exponentially, because countries like Taiwan, if we consider it a country, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, were all discovering the virtues of their particular model of capitalism, following the example of Japan, which had dramatically modernized itself at the end of the 19th century. And all of a sudden, at the end of the 70s, the Chinese, the communist Chinese, the People's Republic of China, decides to do something comparable. Deng Xiaoping, whom you saw there in the trailer, became the senior leader of the Communist Party in 1978, at the end of 1978, and he immediately set about transforming what his party's strategic objectives. And okay, how can I go back to this? Oh, it ran off by itself. Okay, wait. And it was a very, very profound and dramatic break, but it was barely noticed by the outside world at the time. This is very important to keep in mind. At the time, outside observers compared the initial stages of the Chinese economic reform program with Hungary or East Germany or Yugoslavia. East Germany at the time was considered the liberal bulwark of the Soviet bloc. So these reforms that the Chinese began to do, like giving control over their land back to the farmers, were not really understood in the outside world. But it was, in fact, a revolution of far-reaching proportions. Now, we'll come back to this in just a moment when it's appropriate. But so, was this just a coincidence, I began to think, that these dramatic things had all happened in the world at the same time? They don't seem on the surface to have much to do with each other. I couldn't really get a handle on it. But the more I began to think about it, the more I thought that there really was something there, that there was a whole series of dramatic changes at the end of the 1970s that were really worth investigating more deeply. Perhaps they had something to do with each other, perhaps not. The more I began to think about it, I began to think about the idea of transformation. Okay? Deng Xiaoping, in his way, was extremely dramatic, transformative figure. It's hard to imagine anyone else who has had a comparable effect on a leader who's had a comparable effect on his or her country over the past 50 years, maybe 100 years. You know, we often use the metaphor of an aircraft carrier when we talk about turning some big unwieldy thing around. Well, China, I think, is more like, I don't know what the metaphor would be, 100,000, a million aircraft carriers. An enormous, enormous country. You just don't do this overnight. Actually, China's reforms proceeded with extraordinary rapidity and intensity. Within just a few years, collective farms ceased to exist. Then the West began to notice. So I call that a rebel. In my lexicon, that's a rebel, someone who is so utterly transformative that they don't just change the situation, they change the very rules of the game, okay? I began to think about it and I thought, well, Afghanistan certainly went through a very, very profound transformation. For a variety of reasons which we can discuss in the Q&A, I ended up not including Iraq. So I hope that isn't a bait and switch, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. Precisely because I ultimately concluded that the terms of the game didn't really change in Iraq. It was just a shift from one stage to another. But in Afghanistan, that condition certainly seemed to be met. The other big event of this period, it quickly became apparent to me, was the revolution in Iran, right? Ayatollah Khomeini. That's quite obviously a revolution. So Ayatollah Khomeini is a rebel, is he not? A rebel? Well, he was leading a revolution, that makes him a rebel. But what kind of revolution? In the 1960s and 70s, if you were revolutionary, you were, in Europe at least, a long-haired kid, you know, a long-haired young man, usually. They were still quite dominant. You know, women's lib was still getting off the ground, so it was still the boys who tended to call the shots, for better or worse. And they were, these were long-haired young men running around spouting radical rhetoric, perhaps new left rhetoric, maybe not orthodox Marxism. That's what a revolutionary was supposed to be. A revolutionary was not supposed to be an elderly man with a white beard and a turban, and yet a revolutionary he was, Ayatollah Khomeini. What else happened at this moment? Another person I began to think about was John Paul II, the Polish Pope, who was elected in the fall of 1978 by the College of Cardinals. Now, we all know him as a conservative figure. We think of him as the dogmatic conservative Pope who helped rediscover old Catholic traditions. Well, I guess to some extent, yes. But he was a Pope whose time in office actually had dramatic, far-reaching, quite revolutionary implications. And you can see this very dramatically. We saw a little bit of it in the trailer. When he went to Poland in the summer of 1979, a third of the people in the country came out to meet him. And they organized themselves. They did it completely without the Communist Party. They got together. They discovered each other. They found themselves as a nation through the Pope's visit. And with his visit, he started a process of cultural resistance to Soviet rule that many historians have argued, although it is quite controversial in certain quarters, many historians have argued prepared the way for the revolutions of 1989 in East Central Europe, which was actually the moment when I got my start as a journalist in Germany. Also something we can talk about in the Q&A. So transformative figures, Deng Xiaoping, Ayatollah Khomeini, the holy warriors in Afghanistan who staged the uprising against the invading Soviet Union, Pope John Paul II. And then I began to realize, wow, it's kind of an interesting coincidence. There was also quite a dramatic transformation in Great Britain at this moment, of all places. This was the moment when Margaret Thatcher was elected British Prime Minister. Now, was she a rebel, revolutionary? She's a conservative, she's a Tory. How can she be a revolutionary? Well, remember what I said about changing the terms of the game, right? She said to Britons, I want to change the post-war consensus in Britain. The Labour Party came in with its landslide victory in 1945, and they built a particular kind of Britain. And it's become quite clear with the strikes, the declining growth, the inflation, all the problems Britain was having in the 1970s, this model no longer works. So I think we need to do away with it. Utterly, utterly transformative figure. Let's see if I can summon her up here. I'm not sure if I've got the timing of this clip right, but it's always fun to watch. This is Margaret Thatcher's, one of her ads during the 1979 campaign.
Could be unaware of the
a little hard to hear.
responsibility that I'm asking you to give me at this moment of decision for our country. To that I should perhaps add the fact, and if I don't, a lot of others will, that this is the first time in our history that a woman could, after Thursday, be holding the highest political office in our national life. It's never happened before, and I know that despite all the changes in our society, there are some who still feel a little bit uncertain about it. I also know that there are others who would welcome it. I've always believed that what matters in politics, as in the rest of life, isn't who you are or where you come from, but what you believe and what you want to do with your life. What matters are your convictions. So as we approach the end of this campaign, I want to tell you the thoughts and feelings that will guide me in government if you place your confidence in the Conservative Party on Thursday.
Again, it's a wonderful document. I strongly recommend that you look at it if you're interested in this period. Here, we'll let her open her eyes at least. Okay. This woman embodies, in the most literal sense, radical transformation. And I love that passage. She's clearly, been coached a lot. She's been studying her polls. And I love that passage where she says, I know this idea of having a woman prime minister might be a little jarring for some people, right? But get over it, right? It's really fantastic stuff. Any student of politics should study this ad. It's really very fascinating in light of the subsequent changes. She's someone who embodies a certain kind of rejection of the established order. And you have to remember that she's a member of the Conservative Party. And conservatives, ever since 1945, had actually supported, by and large, the Labourite consensus that started in 1945, the creation of the vast British welfare state. If anything, they wanted to nudge it in a direction that was a bit more business-friendly, a bit more open to business. But they really didn't question it very much. They were, after all, conservatives. A famous conservative rival of hers, Ian Gilmore, said, conservatism is not an ism. It's not an ideology. It's not a set of precepts, the way that leftist parties are. Conservatism is preserving what we have, okay? Improving upon what we have, okay? And did you hear what she said about convictions? I believe politicians are about convictions. She described herself always as a conviction politician. That in itself was a provocation to her own party. There's another interesting thing here, though. At one point, in one of her election rallies in 1979, she says, people often describe me as a reactionary, right? This is the 1970s, right? If you were a reactionary, that was really something bad. You didn't want to be described as reactionary. And Thatcher took that and she said, you know what? I am a reactionary. There's a lot to react against, she said. Fantastic. Completely turned the tables on her opponents. And this takes me to the second part of my title, the title of my book. I've been talking about rebels. This is one of the things that makes Margaret Thatcher and the other heroes of my book strange rebels. Okay? I argue in my book that, in fact, these 5 radically different stories, the Iranian Revolution, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Margaret Thatcher's election, Pope John Paul II's visit to Poland, and which one did I leave out? I'm spacing out. Deng Xiaoping, I left out the biggest one, of course. That they all had something in common. They're all about rebels, but they're all strange. What do I mean by that? Well, until now, we tended to think of revolutionaries, a word I will use as a synonym for rebels, as coming from the left. And we thought very particularly that they were secularists, because that was pretty much true of all the big revolutions that people knew in the 20th century, the Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution before it. Hannah Arendt, the great German thinker, said, well, revolutions are inherently secular in nature. So where does somebody like Ayatollah Khomeini fit in? Ayatollah Khomeini was reacting, he was a reactionary as well, and he was reacting to something else, which was basically this. In the 1970s, the Shah of Iran was one of the world's great modernizers. People talked about Iran the way they talk about China today. Oh my God, 10% growth, 12% growth. Can you imagine? People came from all over the world to look at the Iranian economic miracle. And the Shah, in the 1960s, had started something called the White Revolution. And it was a very, very dramatic reform program, nationalization of forests and literacy campaigns and women's rights and industrial modernization and all this stuff that sounded very much like it had been taken from the playbook of the left, which it had, because the dominant opposition in Iran at this time was the Iranian Communist Party, which was one of the biggest, strongest, most powerful communist parties in the world in the 1940s. And the Shah, with some prompting from the Kennedy administration, understood that he needed to do something to make himself look really good and progressive. So he started off on an amazing modernization drive that produced young Iranian women in very, very high skirts. Yeah, come on now. A lot of very, very impressive infrastructural development. Yeah, this isn't quite working, so I'm going to go here. This is one of my favorites. This is the cover of an Iranian fashion magazine. Now, if you were someone like Ayatollah Khomeini, who believed in Islamic values, this was not the kind of thing that you like to see. And so there were a lot of conservative clerics who rejected this brand of modernization, of course, and that was true all over the Islamic world, where similar things were going on, actually. If you look at Egyptian movies from the 1960s and 70s, you're going to see an awful lot of this, you know, people out partying in nightclubs, being debonair and so on. You're not going to see people with long beards. You're not going to see people in mosques, right? The 60s and 70s, you would see things like this. But Ayatollah Khomeini was not just a conservative. He was something a bit different. He had some very radical ideas about clerical rule that were so radical indeed, and so new, in fact, not traditional at all, that many of his fellow clerics strongly rejected them. And something that a lot of Westerners don't understand to this day, there are still ayatollahs, Iranian ayatollahs, who don't accept his views about clerical rule, okay? So to me, Ayatollah Khomeini is not just a conservative, he's a special kind of conservative. He's a conservative who's reacting against the revolution of modernization. You might call it the progressive revolution, because a lot of the ideas of this revolution came from the left. And another thing we can talk about in the Q&A, one of the people who was very inspirational in Iran in the 1970s was a guy named Ali Shariati, who was someone who knew Marxism extremely well. His father was a religious teacher. And Shariati actually had a very intense, powerful, mystical relationship to his own brand of Islam. And he fused more radically than just about anyone else I've ever seen. I'm sure there are other examples out there, but really quite uniquely fused Marxism and the Quran, almost one-to-one, you know. Says, you know, he says, you know, the Quran is the holy book, the same way that, you know, Marx's teachings are a holy book of justice, and, you know, the oppressed, you know, the oppressed proletariat, the oppressed in the world are the people who deserve. It's really quite extraordinary, and it was an extraordinary, powerful synthesis for young people in Iran at the time. They flocked to his lectures. You couldn't get in the door. It was enormously influential. So Shariati was a very good example of somebody who learned from the revolution. He was a conservative who learned from the revolution. A reactionary in some ways, although he was so interested in Marxism you might not have noticed. So these, I think, are excellent examples of strange rebels. John Paul II was a very traditional clergyman, but he understood He came out of Vatican II, actually, right? That very important watermark of modern Catholic life. And he had a very, very intense personal interest in the whole discourse of human rights, because he'd lived under both Nazism and Stalinism. He'd experienced both of them personally. Vatican II was very much about this. There was a lot of articulation of a big program of human rights at Vatican II. And John Paul II was somebody who knew Marxism intimately, right? So he made the welfare of workers, and he made talk of social justice a huge part of his program. And in fact, you might remember that he riled a lot of people in the United States with his skepticism about capitalism, which is kind of interesting. Another strange rebel. The Afghan holy warriors, in keeping with this turmoil that was going on in the Islamic world, had their own views about Islam. They too, not unlike the Iranians, with whom many of them shared a common language, Persian, but they were Sunni. The Afghan holy warriors had lived cheek and jowl with Marxists in Afghanistan in the 1970s. Many of them had been in jail together. They fought each other in high school at the University of Kabul. They knew the Marxists inside and out. And again, they learned a lot from them. They learned the power of a modern political party movement with a conspiratorial cell structure and a program written out, party ID cards. If you joined Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Islamic party, the Hezbi Islami, you had to get an ID card that he printed up for you, and you had to send your children to that school and that refugee camp and pay your dues. This was something quite unusual. There was no precedent for this in the late 19th century in the Islamic world. This was quite a remarkable divergence. And China, and we finally come to China. I love the way they've titled this, Weird China Communist Musical Scene. I love that here on YouTube. Now, what about Deng Xiaoping's revolution? He was a member of the Chinese Communist Party, imprisoned 3 times, always came back. The ultimate political survivor. He was about this tall. He was about 4.5 feet tall. He must have been insanely tough. This is a guy who had paid with his own blood for the victory of the Communist Party in China. But, like so many others, during the Cultural Revolution, he was imprisoned. His son was thrown off the roof of a building, paralyzed for life. All of his comrades were thrown into jail, humiliated. Deng Xiaoping, one of the most senior people in the Communist Party, a close associate of Mao, realized this is not working. This is ridiculous. China, we need a strong China. We don't need a poor China. Mao actually thought poverty was a virtue. It inculcated revolutionary values. Deng and a lot of his comrades said, no, that's wrong. You can't build a strong state when people are poor. We need to change something. And so, as I mentioned earlier, he started off at first very inconspicuously building a new kind of China. And this movie that I want to show you is called Zhao Zibei. Please, I apologize for my Chinese pronunciation. It doesn't translate very well. There are different translations of the movie, but it's basically a kind of easygoing musical set in Shanghai in 1979. And there is actually a lot of politics in it. There's a lot of stuff about, thank goodness we put down the Maoists, they're such evil people. But you wouldn't necessarily guess that from looking at the film. I just want you to look at this and think about the visuals here. This is 3 years after the end of the Cultural Revolution. And if nothing else, it's great fun to watch.
是像燃烧的朝霞呀，又是像月光下的灯海。想到那更美的未来，我要从心里唱出来，我要从心里唱出来。
Okay? Now, why do I show you this? Well, it's quite simply because, well, I don't know if do any of you remember what the Cultural Revolution looked like in China? Yeah? Everyone wearing those identical Mao suits, man and woman. Maybe sometimes blue, maybe sometimes gray. That was all the variation there was. You were supposed to be unattractive. Makeup was frowned upon. Hairdos were frowned upon. Everybody was supposed to look alike, be alike, think alike. Revolutionary purity, revolutionary operas. No colorful balloons, I'll tell you that. None of this individuality stuff. None of this happy singing about things that weren't very important. This is a revolution against revolution. This is counter-revolution. And that essentially is the argument of my book. I argue that what we witness here in these 5 stories is a special kind of revolution. It's a revolution against the big revolutions of the 20th century, the big modernizing revolutions, which were very often driven by ideas about equality between the sexes, equality between groups, between religions, all very uplifting ideas until they ended up in various extremes like the Cultural Revolution. This is a moment when we enter a counter-revolutionary age. And the attack against the big progressive revolutions of the 20th century comes from 2 directions: markets, as in the case of China and the United Kingdom, and religion, as in the case of John Paul II and the Iranian and Afghan revolutions. Afghan revolution, I mean, of course, in this case, the rebellion against communism. So that's the basic thesis of my book. You don't necessarily have to buy all of it, because I think actually these are very, very compelling stories in themselves. But I do think I'm on to something, because when I look at the world around me today, I basically see a world that is very, very much shaped by the forces that these people unleashed. Thank you very much. So, wow, I just noticed that. That's not a very nice photo. Okay. Wonder where the hell that comes from. All right. Sorry about that. So, any questions? I would love to hear your questions. Yes?
Christian, did you look at a few
Oh, do we have a microphone? Somebody have a microphone? Yeah.
Did you look at some other situations that you thought were close but didn't quite make it, and decide they didn't fit in and exclude them for one reason or another?
That's an excellent question. I have to stress this is not a book about all the cool things that happened in 1979, okay? I ended up being very selective in my choice of story, and the mathematicians and the engineers among you may decide that I suffer from sample bias. That's entirely possible. I became fascinated by these stories because I really felt they were all game changers. I felt that these were stories that really changed the ways that we think about politics and economics. So, for example, before Thatcher came along, the word privatization was not really commonly used in the English language. And in fact, she didn't like the word at first. She much preferred denationalization, which she thought sounded a little less scary. Islamist, at least in the West, I mean, there's a lot of debate about the very term, I know, but the word Islamist was hardly seen before this period. You know, the idea of a revolutionary Islam, right? Again, hardly heard of before this period. And that's very much because of the Iranian Revolution. So I became fascinated by these events as events that changed the very terms of the game. So for me, Saddam Hussein's rise to power didn't really do that. It perhaps changed the strategic calculation in the Middle East. It certainly changed life for the worse for many Iraqis. It certainly changed the lives of many Iranians and Kuwaitis who ended up being the victim of his designs. But I'm not sure it really changed anything fundamental about the way we thought about things. 1979 was also the year of the big peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. Again, a very controversial, much interpreted event. I ultimately decided I wasn't that interested in it because, again, it didn't really change the fundamental terms of the discussion, of the debate. It changed the strategic balance. It allowed Israel to do certain other things, probably led to the invasion of Lebanon a few years later because Israel knew that they were covered on their southwest flank by the Egyptians having signed the peace treaty. It certainly had a lot, it was a very important event, but I'm not sure it really changed anything on a fundamental level, right? So that was kind of my criterion. I became fascinated by these five events because I felt they really changed the terms of the debate itself, the way we think about politics and economics. I hope that's a yes. If you could. Sorry.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
If it was up to you, if you were in the position to make the decision, how would you hope that this narrative informs the formation of our foreign policy today, and I guess specifically in the Middle East?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I've thought about that so much. How does this inform our policy calculations in the Middle East? Well, I think certainly that I have a somewhat naive belief, perhaps, that drones are a limited way of getting what you want in the Islamic world. I would like to see a much more powerful public policy outreach. I would like to see us spending billions of dollars understanding the rest of the world rather than just bombing it. There is certainly often a reason for the use of military force, but one of the conclusions that I reached from my research into this book was never underestimate the power of reaction, right? So the more you're trying to impose a narrative on other people by compulsion or force, the more that will tend to rebound on you. I'm very much in favor of public outreach to the Islamic world. Call it propaganda if you like, I don't know. I'm in favor, I think, more of an active discussion with the countries of the Islamic world. There is no Islamic world, it's all too different. I don't want to put them all into one barrel. It's all much, much too different. But I do feel we've somewhat neglected that. You know, I think it is important to talk about the things that Al-Qaeda, many of the Islamists have actually done to other Muslims, right? But of course, you won't be very credible as an interlocutor, as somebody discussing that with other people, if your main policy presence in that country is droning them, right? I mean, again, don't get me wrong, drones clearly have made themselves very, very useful as a very targeted tool of the counter-terrorist struggle. But I think it's also a very limited tool strategically. It's not a strategy, maybe a tactic, but not a strategy. I think in general, I feel like my research into these areas has led me to bemoan the lack of a genuine strategy by the United States in a lot of these places. But that's probably on such a level of abstraction, I'm not sure it really helps. Yes, please.
Would you care to comment on the effect of the 5 events that you picked out in '79 affected the next 2 decades, particularly the final years of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union, and whether these 5 events had a role in that or didn't, and what degree of importance they had to that?
Sure. That's a great question. I think the 2 key events here, the proximate events here, as far as the collapse of the Soviet Union is concerned, are certainly Afghanistan and Poland. This is in East Central Europe. John Paul II triggered this very, very important, you could call it a human rights revolution, which had already been underway, right? Václav Havel and his colleagues signed the Charter 77 2 years before this, Czechoslovakia, which was a demand for their own government to recognize the terms of the Helsinki agreements, which turned out to be a very potent weapon in the struggle for greater freedom for people in East Central Europe. And this struggle was explicitly nonviolent. It was explicitly about building a cultural and spiritual counter-reality to Soviet communism. And Timothy Garton Ash, British historian, you can love him, you can hate him, you might disagree with him violently, but I agree with his formula, which was no pope, no Polish pope, no solidarity. No solidarity, no 1989. So I think there's a direct pedigree going from the Pope's visit, 1979, to the formation of solidarity the next year in Gdansk, and that peaceful, nonviolent cultural revolution that it inspired, and then the events in 1989, which, again, I witnessed personally. And once you've been there, I was in the demonstration in Leipzig in 1989, when 250,000 people were marching around the center of town, past the Stasi building, holding candles in the dark, and chanting, "No violence, no violence." The whole meeting started in a church. And once you've confronted that, it's quite powerful stuff. The other event is, of course, Afghanistan. I think personally that the war in Afghanistan was hugely important. I think that it was an enormous financial drain. It was such an enormous financial drain on the Soviets, especially with oil prices going down. We have to add that was a very important factor in all of this. The Soviets told the Poles, made it more, they threatened the Poles a lot, the Polish communists, threatened them with invasion if you don't get this solidarity thing under control in the 1980s. But we now know secretly they were saying among themselves, we don't really have the resources to invade and hold down Poland. We've already got this Afghan thing bleeding the hell out of us, right? So you can see there's a kind of fascinating synergy between those two events. And I think both of those events are very crucial for the rise of Gorbachev and what happens then in the Soviet Union. There were a lot of other things involved. I'm not a monocausalist. I don't believe that one thing, causes some huge historical event. I generally believe in a lot of causes, a lot of sources. But I think certainly the significance of these two things, Poland and Afghanistan. Afghanistan, of course, also inspires a great uneasiness among the Muslim population in the Soviet Union. People often forget that if the Soviet Union had gone on, it would have become a Muslim majority country within a couple of years, because the birth rate in the Muslim majority republics was so enormously higher than the birth rate in the European republics of the Soviet Union. So if the Soviet Union had gone on to 1993 or 1994, we might be talking about a Soviet Union in which Slavs and Europeans were a minority. Interesting thought. Anyway, that's my thought. Yes?
Hi. So I might have missed it in your talk, but those 5 dramatic events are pretty impressive, and all happened within a very intense period of time.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you can draw any more general conclusion from the 5 coincidences to say something about that era of the entire world, what is going on, why they are intercorrelated, or are they just pure coincidences?
Yeah. Well, again, ultimately we can only speculate about how they correlate. I do find this conservative vector that all the events share very compelling. I can't prove anything here, right? But I do find it very compelling. It is a very compelling correlation indeed, maybe not mutual causation. But there is one thing I have a kind of hunch about, which is I think it has to do with something generational. And you have to remember globalization. The word globalization starts in the 1970s. The word was used for the first time in 1974, okay? Partly as a result of the first oil crisis, there was a lot of talk of interdependence. Suddenly people began to realize the world really was an economic unit in a way it hadn't been before. So people are very aware in the 1970s, satellite technology is getting very cheap, telecommunications are getting very cheap, air travel is very cheap. And so people are beginning to think about how closely connected things are in the world, right? I think that's a powerful factor here. But I think it has something to do with generational dynamics, because at the end, I mean, this is a huge, huge kind of discussion, but I'll say it very as concisely as I can. At the end of the Second World War, we had a new beginning in the West. And the United States and Europe set off on an unbelievable period of economic expansion that was just unprecedented in human history. And that expansion went straight through well into the 1970s, and then it began to founder and grind to a halt. The Bretton Woods system collapsed in the early 1970s. There was just this general sense that that wasn't working anymore. So this is very much the thing that Margaret Thatcher comes out of. There was this new thing called stagflation. Until then, there was the kind of Keynesian assumption that you could stimulate the economy by pumping it, a certain amount of inflation into it, and employment would grow and productivity would grow. And then you hit this thing where you had both inflation and stagnation. People were like, wow, how do you deal with that? And there was a sense that the old solutions had run out of steam. So that's part of the dynamic in the West, and I think very much the world that Margaret Thatcher comes from. In the developing world, you have a very interesting dynamic, which is decolonialization after 1945. And you have this whole new generation of leaders, some of whom are, monarchists or authoritarians, but a lot of them are, I think I would say, progressives, socialist, soft, sometimes not so soft, but socialist, authoritarian, secular modernizers. Think of the Congress Party in India, perfect example, right? They were all very much, think of the Israelis. I mean, the Zionists were all secular socialists, no, right-wing religious radicals there when they started off. And this was very true in the Arab world. Baathism was a secular ideology. A lot of modernizing secular independence leaders, people come up. And then that also hits a brick wall. 1967, the Israeli victory is a huge disillusionment for the Islamic world. People begin to say, wait, this isn't working. These leaders are corrupt, they're tyrannical, they're unjust. Maybe we need to be going back to some of our old solutions. And then in China, of course, you have the Cultural Revolution, this incredible paroxysm, The Great Leap Forward, probably much, much worse before that. And you get a sense of just exhaustion and paralysis, which reaches into the very highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party. And so maybe coming at it from different angles, I do feel like there is some kind of generational thing going on there. And of course now, one has the feeling we've reached the end of another cycle. Now it's about as far away from 1979 as 1979 was to 1945. And I see a lot of people questioning the free market orthodoxy. I see, a Libya where people vote in a free election against the Islamist parties, even though it's a deeply conservative Islamic country. They don't want that. They don't want the Muslim Brotherhood running their lives. We don't have to get into Egypt. That's a free election, though, and quite a free and fair election. It was a dramatic thing. So I can't help but feel that somehow we're nearing the end of another cycle. I hope that's approaching an answer to your question.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, please. Yeah.
If I could just follow on to that last question.
Yes.
I'm wondering how much of this is, hindsight being 20/20.
Probably all of it.
Which is not surprising. So in other words, to simplify, in the 60s and 70s, I should say, the center of gravity shifts to the left. We have a concern about social justice, decreasing oppression, moving against the forces and institutions that are perceived to be responsible for lack of social justice and oppression, et cetera, et cetera. Those folks don't go away, itching for a comeback. They have come back, and you're basically saying this is how we got to where we are today. And so we looked in the rearview mirror, and you're arguing these were the critical events 34 or so years ago. So I guess I'm wondering, is that pretty much what we're saying? You've packaged it in a way that makes it all comprehensible. But as a corollary, were there folks around, you know, at that time in the early 80s or even the very late 70s who looked into the crystal ball, packaged these events together intellectually and said, I think, you know, 20, 25, 30 years, this is pretty much where we're going to be, if you know?
Okay, I'll tackle that as well as I can. Well, one of the really interesting things at the time was the way that observers put Khomeini and John Paul II in the same box. That's quite fascinating when you go back as a historian and you look at it. Because nowadays we wouldn't think of doing that necessarily, right? Khomeini, you know, love him or hate him, human rights, you know, was not really very high on the list for him. Whereas it was a very central thing for John Paul II. It was perhaps the central thing. Khomeini was, in fact, obsessed with justice from an Islamic viewpoint, and if you were in the way of his vision of justice, you got rolled over. But at the time, people didn't know how to make sense of these things at all. So there were a lot of people saying, oh, well, John Paul II is the Western version of Ayatollah Khomeini, or some such version thereof, which is really quite fascinating. People also compared Khomeini to Gandhi, which now seems quite comical, right? But again, you know, it was so unprecedented. You have to put yourself back in that moment when this whole idea of combining Islam and revolution was just completely incomprehensible. People couldn't wrap their minds around it. And so people compare him to Gandhi, who was also a religious leader who led a revolutionary struggle against a foreign oppressor or something. So that's quite interesting. China, the interesting thing about China is how little anyone at the time understood how important it was, right? I think Deng Xiaoping had an actually quite clear strategic vision. He was an unbelievable strategic thinker, a very tough guy. I mean, you know, again, not very, as we know, not very worried about human rights. But he had a strategic vision and he stuck to it with absolute ruthlessness and consistency. So I think he knew where he was going. We have these amazing conversations with him in 1978 where he's talking to his aides about his trips to Singapore and Japan. And it's not at all, none of it's about Marxism or class struggle. He says, do you know a worker in Singapore can buy his own apartment with his bonus? You know? It's all this stuff about market incentives and how you get people to produce better and work better in 1978, which to me was just an astonishing thing to discover. But the outside world didn't really pick up on that very well because the magnitude of it was not yet very apparent, right? Thatcher, people had very mixed ideas about Thatcher. Some said, oh, well, she talks like a bit of a radical, but when she's in power, you know, she'll tone it down. They always do, right? There's a great book written by a journalist about her first year in power, you know, written in 1980, which basically says that. And then other people said, oh, she's going to turn, that's fascinating to read people in 1979 at the time of the election saying, oh, you have no idea, this woman is serious, she's going to turn everything on its head. I think the reality ended up perhaps a little bit more modest than that. But no, sure, of course it's all hindsight, yeah. I mean, one of the things that this project taught me was it's very hard to see what's important at the moment, right? I mean, the Syria struggle right now is clearly a huge, important thing in international relations. But will we look back one day, 30 years later, and say, oh yeah, 2013 was the year that gay marriage suddenly broke through in the United States, and that was the start of the worldwide gay marriage revolution, which now, you know, has penetrated every country. I don't know. Will there be some kind of technological development? You know, 3D printing is very trendy now. Well, people say 2012 was the year, you know, 3D printing became commercially viable, and today we understand how it's completely transformed every aspect of life, but at the time people didn't really quite, you know. So hindsight, I plead guilty, totally. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
No, definitely. And,
oh, good.
And predictive value is often in short supply anyways. Yeah, so I appreciate
Yeah, I'm
that.
actually fascinated by the problem of prediction, and Wow, you know, if you ever lick that one, I'll be very impressed. So, anyone else? Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming. I hope it was worth your while, and I really do appreciate it. If you ever want to get in touch with me, my Twitter handle is @ccaryl, C-C-A-R-Y-L. You can also send me an email at christian.caryl@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Okay? Thank you.